Welcome back. I'm Paul McManus from Nothing Here Is Real. This is part 3 of behind the scenes of the animation Stranded. Now we're going to set up the hair system for some physics simulations. So make sure the plane is selected, go into the particle system, click on Advanced, set the number of segments to 25. This will be important later when the hairs start moving. We want hair dynamics, you can leave that set to the default. Open the cache panel. Set the start to 500 and the end to 1440. This will give us a 1 minute animation at 24 frames per second. Scroll further down to render and click on B-spline. Set the number of steps to 7. And then so we can see the same thing in the viewport, click on display and select 7 steps under colour. And if you scroll right down to the bottom, make sure that root and tip are set to 1. In order that the hairs don't just collapse to the floor right at the start, set the gravity to minus 0.01. Now we're going to the properties area, down to geometry. We want curved segments, thick, and cull back faces should not be checked. The physics simulation that drives the hair motion starts at frame 500. We use a vortex field as the source, and that's positioned at a Z height of 3 above the plane. So if we position the cursor to the center and then add the force field vortex and then set its Z height to 3, you can see the force field there. We need to adjust the frame count here. As we've already rendered out the first 200 frames, we don't need to do that again. And indeed it won't work because we've changed the material now. So set the start frame to 201. With the force field selected, if we go into the physics tab here, the current frame set to 500. Put a keyframe on a strength of 0 and the noise of 0. And this effectively ensures that all the frames leading up to 500, that vortex force field will have no effect on anything. We need to add some more keyframes now for this vortex force field in order to make it do something. So the next position was 720. And at that frame, I used a strength of 4, and again, a keyframe, and a noise of 1, and again, a keyframe. At 1300, the strength drops to 1, and again, keyframe. And at 1400, the strength is 10, and the noise is 0. So that's the force field setup. Now what we need to do is bake the hair system physics. So we select the plane again, go to the particle system, go up to the cache panel and click on bake. Now this is going to take a little while, so I'll speed this bit up and come back to you once the bake is finished. Okay, the bake is now complete, and we can now take a look at this and see whether the geometry is moving as we expect. So at the very start it's vertical, and then when we reach 500 the physics sim starts to cut in and it spreads out, and the vortex gets hold of it, spins it round, it rises up, and eventually becomes very thin at the end. So that's now as I expected, and we're ready to sort out the material for that. In part 2 I went through setting up the node setup for the material that we've used for this hair system. If you recall, we have 2 input values. The top one represents the position of the transition band and the bottom one represents the height of the transition band. I've set that to a constant value of 0.03, but we want the value of the position to vary as time progresses through the video. And this value starts at 0. I'll just show you what this looks like. So you can see now that's at the 50% mark. We've got the red transition band and then the green cyan colour. So at 250, we want this to be 0. And we set a keyframe on that. And that effectively means that all the frames from 0 to 250 are going to have the transition band at the base of the hair, and indeed we'll only see half of that transition band because the other half is before the start of the hair. We'll put another keyframe at 1200, which will be 1. You will be able to see that the transition band is now right at the end of the hairs, and we're only seeing that bottom half now. And it stays that way for the last 240 frames of the video. So now, if we go back to that view, as we scrub through the timeline, you'll see that the hair system changes. And eventually finishes off as a very thin object. And as we progress through that, the transition band rises up the hair system. Now, to complete the video, we've got several camera moves in here. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but I'll just outline what they are. The first camera move is a linear motion, basically 150 frames, 200 to 350, where we just move in a straight line with the camera looking at the side, passing the base of the hair system, passing the plane roughly in that position. Then from 350 through to 850, we simply pull back and show the whole system. So by the time it reaches 850, you're looking at something like that. And then 850 for the remainder we zoom back in, and for the final shots, we're focused on the tip there. And that becomes the focal point for the last few frames. In addition, I continued changing the depth of field, focus distance, and the f-stop values. There are about 30 keyframes with various tweaks to those values as the remainder of the video progresses. These were fairly arbitrary and set by eye. There is no specific process in there for how those were set. So then it's simply a case of rendering those frames out and compositing them together. There was no compositing done on this other than reading those frames back in and stringing them together with some transitions between each section. I'd like to briefly mention the render settings that I used to generate the output. Originally, I decided to set up a camera for each phase of the animation and then bind the camera transitions to markers in the timeline and then have everything go out to a single folder. Because I made a few tweaks and changes along the way, this proved not to be an ideal arrangement. And even though I've left this set up, the resulting blend file got reused several times, 4 times in fact, so this is Q4. And I set it up so that each session generated a different folder of PNG files. You can see this is 5, and that's because I had another change of heart in the middle of one of the outputs that I'll explain in a second. But effectively, there's a camera for each phase, there's a folder for each phase, and the output is a PNG, no alpha channel. And for the sampling, originally I had it set to just regular path tracing. I experimented a little bit with the settings here and found that with branched path tracing I could get a little bit of an edge on the render times. And as you can see, these are all 1. And really what we needed here was just anti-aliasing. It's a little bit noisy at the opening scene, but I was prepared to live with that because I thought that was a nice visual effect. So change the seed on every frame. This moves the noise around so that you don't see noise patterns as the animation progresses. I clamped at 1. This is all emission, so that wasn't unreasonable. Set the AA samples to 36 so that we get a reasonable amount of anti-aliasing in the rendered output. All the samples are set to 1. That's it for sampling. If we scroll down to light paths, there is a bit of transparency in here, and when the hair fibers are all clumped together, we need that up to 32 in this case, in order that we don't start to see black artifacts in the hair system. The rest is minimal because we're not looking at any radiosity effects or transparency or translucency that needs to bounce. We can get rid of these caustics, refractive and reflective caustics. I also added in motion blur. When the hair system gets moving vigorously, about half the way through, this does help sell the motion a little bit better. It increases the render time a tad, but I thought it was worth it. Those are the render settings. I then use this to create several folders with PNG files in, which we'll get into in a second. Here we are in the video sequence editor. All the output PNG files that were generated in the previous blend file are now loaded back in strips. Together with an ident still frame with the web address and a copyright notice. So this is how I set up this kind of thing. We have a soundtrack here. This is the audio that goes with the ident. These salmon color boxes are crossfades. So effectively we load in a sequence of frames, load in the next sequence and add in a crossfade, load in the next sequence and add in a crossfade, load in the next sequence and add in a crossfade. And so then there's a nice transition between each of these PNG file groups. Now, one small thing that I thought I'd show was I dropped the ball in this sequence, and if I scrub along here, you'll see that at this point I got the depth of field slightly wrong and it's all blurred. Now it's only for one small segment of that, probably, I don't know, 1/4 to 1/3 of the number of frames in that particular phase. So what I did was I modified the blend file, changed the depth of field, and re-rendered out a small number of frames here that were sharper, as you can see there. I then overlay that on top of the original frames and then used that to hide the PNG images in the frames underneath it. So in the VSE, you can think of the visibility of the strips. The priority is from the top. The frames here effectively obscure the frames here. And then because the camera motion is exactly the same, all I needed to do was find a start point where there was no difference between those two sections, and then the transition is seamless. Because we're using a crossfade here, this meant that the end of this section wasn't going to be visible anyway. Okay, so that's how I set it all up. I've had a couple of people ask me about the audio. This is a composition I put together using Ableton Live, and the full piece can be found on SoundCloud for anyone who's interested. The ident was just prepared in a separate Blender file, and that just allows me then to drop that in as an addendum, as are the ends still with the web address and the copyright notice. And that's it. Then you render that out. What I use is FFmpeg video to MPEG-4 H.264, high quality, very slow, smallest file. I normally put the keyframe output to half the frame rate, so if I'm at 24 frames per second, I normally put the keyframe interval to 12. That seems to give me a good balance between quality and file size. For YouTube videos, I'll generally create perceptually lossless files because YouTube transcodes that downwards, and transcoding never improves the quality. So you want to have the best quality you can have there. Okay, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it made sense. I'd love to hear any feedback you might have about this. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.